Some memories refused to die. Years later, survivors of Goliad were still haunted by that morning. They had been battlefield prisoners in an unforgiving war, so no one expected comfort served on a silver tray. But they also didn't expect Palm Sunday of 1836 to become a slaughter. Hundreds of men cut down under the orders of a general determined to crush an uprising. Gunfire, blood, men begging for their lives. And somewhere inside that carnage stood a woman named Francita Alavez. Then, almost as quickly as she appeared, she slipped into the fog of history. Someone that no one knew. A person they would never forget. To the lives she saved that day, she would forever be known as the Angel of Goliad. To understand why Francita Alavez mattered, you first have to understand what happened at Goliad. I recently traveled through South Texas, visiting the places where this story unfolded. One of those stops was the Coleto Creek Memorial, about 10 miles outside of this small Texas town. Today, it's a quiet patch of Texas prairie. In March of 1836, it was a battlefield. The Alamo had fallen just weeks earlier, and Mexican forces under General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna were pushing deeper into Texas. As the revolution intensified, Colonel James Fannin was ordered to abandon the fort at Goliad and retreat east with his men. He never made it. Near Coleto Creek, Fannin's command was intercepted by Mexican forces led by General Jose de Urrea. After a day of fighting in the open prairie, the Texians surrendered. They believed they were prisoners of war and would be treated accordingly. They were marched back to the Presidio La Bahía in Goliad. There they waited, and while the prisoners waited behind the stone walls of La Bahía, orders from Santa Anna were on their way, and those orders would change everything. Among the people moving through the fort was a woman history usually remembers as Francita Alavez, but even her name is part of the mystery. I spoke with Dan Alvarez Garza, author and researcher behind The Angel of Goliad, an investigation of Francisca Alvarez. Dan has spent decades researching her life and legacy, in part because he discovered he is one of her descendants. And according to Dan, the confusion around her name may go all the way back to her childhood.
We did not know anything about her. As a matter of fact, when she was in Goliad, she didn't even know her name. Why was she saying her name was Francisca, Francita? Like she was confused about her name. As a matter of fact, she would tell some of the soldiers, they call me Indian.
Dan's research identifies her more formally as Francisca Alvarez, while many Texas history sources continue to use Francita Alavez. Either way, both names lead back to the same woman, the Angel of Goliad. By the spring of 1836, survivor accounts were already describing a woman traveling with the Mexican army who repeatedly intervened on behalf of captured Texians. Throughout her time with the Mexican army, she reportedly persuaded guards to loosen restraints that were cutting into prisoners' wrists while advocating for food, water, and better treatment. Now inside La Bahía, she continued doing the same for Colonel Fannin and his men. She wasn't a Texian revolutionary fighting for Texas independence. Yet while generals debated policy and officers carried out orders, Francita became known for something much simpler: compassion. And as the days stretched on, compassion was becoming increasingly difficult to find. On March 27, 1836, Palm Sunday, it would nearly disappear altogether. At dawn of that morning, the prisoners were ordered from their quarters and organized into groups. Some were told they would be gathering wood and supplies. More than 400 Texian prisoners were marched away from the fort between two rows of Mexican soldiers. The men were then ordered to halt and turn away from their guards. Their confusion turned to panic as the soldiers opened fire at point-blank range. Men dropped into pools of their own blood. Others ran for the tall grass, only to be pursued across the prairie. The wounded were finished off with bayonets and knives. Back at the fort, nearly 40 sick and injured who had been unable to march faced an equally grim fate, killed in their beds or shot against the walls of the chapel. Among them was Colonel James Fannin. He was the last to be executed, forced to watch and listen as his men were killed. Taken into the courtyard, blindfolded, and seated in a chair, Fannin made 3 requests: that his personal belongings be returned to his family, to be shot in the heart and not the face, and to be given a Christian burial. The soldiers kept his possessions and shot him in the face. The dead were hastily gathered and burned, their remains left exposed to the elements. And yet amid the terror and bloodshed, Francita frantically pleaded for mercy.
She even cursed Santa Anna, and she tried to convince the officers, hey, don't do this. They gave up, they're prisoners. You cannot just shoot them, execute them. And at that point that is when she tried to convince as many as the officers and also take out a lot of the young soldiers, because she really cared about the young soldiers that shouldn't be even there.
She argued with officers to spare survivors. She convinced them they still needed doctors, interpreters, and young men who should never have been marked for execution. According to survivor accounts, she appealed directly to Mexican officers, including Colonel Francisco Garay, and succeeded in saving a number of prisoners from execution. Other accounts credit her with helping prisoners escape under cover of darkness and working with sympathetic officers to hide men until the massacre had passed. While others carried out atrocities, Francita spent the day fighting to save whoever she could. As survivors told and retold the story of what happened at Goliad, Francita Alavez appeared again and again. Several survivors later were adamant they owed their lives to Francita's intervention. Today, reminders of her strength still stand across Goliad, just yards away from the Fannin Monument, the final resting place for those who were killed. A statue stands in honor of a woman who stood in defiance of Santa Anna's orders. For someone remembered so vividly by survivors, the truth about who this woman was and what happened to her after these events is surprisingly difficult to pinpoint. What remains are the stories left behind by the men she helped save. Stories that nearly 2 centuries later still carry her name forward. Not because she won a battle or commanded an army, but because on one of the darkest days of the Texas Revolution, she chose mercy.
She only cared about humanity. And that's the whole thing right there. She didn't care who you were, where you came from. She was going to help you no matter what.
And for the men who survived Goliad, that was something worth remembering.